Mindfulness is, if you like, a state of how we might approach something. So there's nothing really particularly complicated about it. It's just recognizing that our brain or our minds probably work in different ways. We would have a doing part of the brain, which we're very good at as athletes or when we're working. So we're engaged in what we're very, very much doing. We would have a thinking part of the brain, and we would have our observing part of the brain, which is where people are really talking about when they go in mindfulness, I think. And what mindfulness probably teaches us is that actually a lot of the time we don't have massive control of our brain, particularly if we think about the thinking part of our brains. It's very, very easy to actually lose what we're thinking about. So if I say to you, and the classic example is, don't think about an elephant, what's the image that comes into your mind?
The elephant.
And of course, one of the things that we're getting, and one of the reasons that mindfulness is becoming more and more important, is that probably the way our lives are made up is that, you know, they tend to be fragmented in terms of where it asks our thoughts to go almost from minute to minute to minute. And, you know, people these days tend to be very much always on, if you like, in the fact that, you know, we've got technology, which is a great bonus to us, but it also has its costs. And we're really working with fairly heavily activated brains a lot of the time. And if you think, you know, we're on technology, any bit of information we want is at our fingertips. We have those brains which are much probably more highly activated than they might have been 20, 30, 40 years ago. If we look at what worry is, it's probably about having an activated brain, and then it's having something to worry about. And if you think about it, what we're really doing is we're always putting the first half of that equation in place, because we're running with fairly heavily activated brains a lot of the time. And then all you need is actually something go a little bit wrong, and we can go into quite high states of anxiety around that. And that's different to performance anxiety. That's different from a specific, that is, you know, almost that sort of generalized anxiety, which is quite hard to live with. It can be quite wearing. So when we start to look at mindfulness, what we're almost doing is giving our brains a little holiday, and we're also allowing it to deactivate slightly and come down. So mindfulness is really purely that act of using that observing part of the brain. So we might equate it to meditation, but it doesn't have to be. It can be just really being engaged in observing whatever there is in front of you. And when I say observing, that could be what we hear, what we see, what we feel, you know. So the senses that we have are actually taking notice of what there is, that we just take that in. It can be about our breath. But what mindfulness always also teaches us is about how little control we have of our brain. So quite often I will be working with clients where we might do a very nice, and we can do one at the end of this, a very nice easy breathing exercise where we focus on our breathing. And afterwards I ask people, okay, what happened to your attention during that? And they'd say, oh, I didn't do it very well. I didn't do it very well because I started thinking about something else. Now, actually, that's a recognition of how our brains work, not about how well we're doing mindfulness. The act of doing mindfulness is to observe something and notice when other things come into our brains, and to allow them to pass. And sometimes things will be coming into our brains all the time, and that will probably be a reflection of how activated we are. But we're still going through that process of mindfulness. So for active people, I often use an active method of mindfulness where I would get them to perhaps go for a walk and simply start off with perhaps some abdominal breathing, where we're breathing into our tummies. We're starting to use that vagus nerve. So as we breathe in, our heart rate decreases. As we breathe out, our heart rate decreases, my apologies. As we breathe in, our heart rate increases, and as we breathe out, our heart rate decreases. And just actually by breathing into the abdomen, it stops us panting. So it stops us from breathing further and further into our chest. So we can start to take our heart rate down a little bit, and we can change that ratio by breathing out for a little bit longer, which starts to trick our bodies into thinking we're nice and relaxed, which of course then tells our minds we're nice and relaxed. So we can start to just do a little bit of work just to relax our systems. And then I just ask people just to look at 5 things that they see as they're walking, and just take notice. So just observe 5 things and really, really look at them. So rather than just, as we would typically do, go along with all our thoughts churning through our heads and hoping the walk that does us good on its own, really take that time to really study 5 things. And that might take you a minute to study 5 things, or it might take you 10 minutes. It really doesn't matter. And then really, really listen to 5 things, and you'd be amazed what's going on in the world outside you that you haven't attended to. So what it tells us is about how our attention can really shift depending on where we put it. And if our attention is on our internal thoughts and the things that are worrying us, we shouldn't be surprised that actually if most of our energy goes into that. If we start to put our attention out into that observing part of the world, what we see, what we hear, and then we can also look at what we feel. So it might be what we feel bodily, but it may be what we notice about our emotions, and just observing those emotions. And I purposely use the word observing, because what we're not trying to do is change anything or add anything to it. We might look at our emotions and go, actually, I feel quite jangled, or I feel quite calm. But what we don't then do is go, I feel jangled because of this. We're just looking at it as an interested party. And in essence, that's what mindfulness is that ability to just observe something without adding anything else to it.
And how does, if you're observing something, and how does an athlete then, or anybody, it's not just an athlete, mindfulness, how do they then recognize that as a positive part for them? Like what are they hoping to get out of mindfulness as a task, I guess, or as a thing?
Well, yeah, no, and that's absolutely right to ask. And one of the things I'd say is probably people would think mindfulness isn't for everybody, but we probably all do it to an extent. When we're fully engaged in something, to an extent we're using mindfulness. But what we have, if we recognize that we're in a world where probably we're operating at a slightly charged rate, our sympathetic nervous system should be in balance with our parasympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system is the part that really is that fight or flight system, and it charges us up to make us go. And the parasympathetic nervous system is that system which is responsible for resting, digesting. So those two ideally are in a balance, and it's a little bit of a pull and push, but you want those two to be operating together. If we operate in a way where actually we're very much charged on that sympathetic nervous system for our lives, what we're producing is a lot of adrenaline. Probably the stress hormone cortisol is also been produced, and over time that can be very, very wearing. And a lot of the kind of immune system issues come from grinding that system down over a long period of time, or over revving that system over a long time. You know, it's a system that we should be dipping in and out of, but if we live in a way where it's always been slightly revved, then over time we're wearing out that system. It's a little bit like having a moped. It will go fast, but not for very long. And if you rev a moped all day, don't be surprised if it doesn't last very, very long. And so what we're trying to do is get that balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic system. And what we're actually doing is we're starting to give little holidays during the day that bring us out of that parasympathetic system. And of course, if we looked at it from the perspective of an athlete, and you have an athlete who's revving too hard all the time, their buffer, if you like, the amount of space they've got between being able to cope with training and becoming overtrained, gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And one of the big skills you're trying to achieve as a coach is to get that training response with an athlete, but not have them injured, or not have them overtrained, or not have them become sick. And if you think about it in simple terms, the bigger we can make that buffer, the easier the job is for you and your athlete to get a really lovely training effect with the minimum of risk.
So you drew a really nice diagram a while ago about that whole concept of, you got your initial starting fitness, and then you apply a training load, so that's going down, that classic down, then up to recovery, and then down again. And what we're talking about with that buffer is that bottom bit there, which is how low you're able to go, and that buffer is how much space you allow it to go. So in essence, that mindfulness exercise and being mindful of the area, that balancing off that parasympathetic to the sympathetic nervous system, is almost reducing that bottom bit there. It's not increasing the buffer, it's actually reducing the kind of the floor, if you like. So you've got more space that you can go a bit deeper and then be able to train more.
You've got more space without running the risk of going from overreaching, which you're planning for, into overtraining, which you really don't want.
Yeah.
And if you like, we can look at athletes and we can say, well, okay, what we're doing is we're really impacting their systems. And you want to be able to impact the system because you want a response. We've got to put load on the system to get that system to adapt. But if we can have a resilient system that we can work with there, that likes to adapt, and we're not using up its resources elsewhere from the micro traumas or the stresses of life, and we're actually dealing with that as that goes along, then we give a more robust system to put that training load onto. And absolutely, you want to stress a system, but you want to stress it in a way that it can recover. And if you're missing that part out of it, then you will, and I'm sure you will have athletes, or you will have had athletes over time, who get more than their fair share of colds, more than their fair share of micro injuries, and you may notice what their lifestyle looks like around that. And actually, just to put some skills in, which also, by the way, starts to put a level of control in. So we might do mindfulness, and actually during your mindfulness, you might recognize, I spend half my life on my phone and I always feel jangled after it. And actually, if I put my phone away after 6 o'clock, I sleep better. So mindfulness isn't just about the physiological benefits it gives us. It can also be about the insights that come with it and the behavioral changes that we may make as a result of that. We may notice that we drink, we get stomach acid, we don't sleep so well. We like to drink, but we don't like stomach acid, and we don't like not sleeping. So, a mindful approach might say, well, actually, I know I like drinking, but if I stop drinking and I don't get those other things, actually, is that worthwhile? And the choice might be, yes, it is. And just being mindful is actually about just being able to look at things without adding lots and lots of extra load and expectation to them, and just noting them for what they are. And I think if we looked at the term being mindful, how often we actually add other meaning to stuff. And we talked a little while ago about anxiety, and we can think about the sort of catastrophizing thoughts that can start to happen with, oh, I feel a little bit nervous about the competition coming up. And actually, a mindful approach would be, yeah, okay, I feel nervous about the competition. Oh, good. That tells me I need to do the stuff that prepares me for the competition, rather than it might be an unmindful approach. Might be, I feel nervous about the competition. Oh my God, that means that I'm going to perform badly, and my girlfriend will leave me, and I probably can't go to work because I feel so sick. It can take us into this, I'm exaggerating, but that very catastrophizing way of thinking, rather than, yeah, there's a competition, I feel anxious. Well, of course I do, because there's a competition and it means something to me. And then we can go into, so what do we do about it? So it does a number of things. It allows us to recognize where our thinking can take us and how little control we have of our thinking, but it can actually give us those psychophysiological holidays
Mm.
as well.
I guess for me, the key thing is being aware of it, because the minute you're aware of it, you can actually do something about it.
Yeah.
You know, that which is measured as improved, you know, go back to the classic consultancy or coaching approach. But actually, if you're starting to recognize negative or positive thoughts or feelings and everything else because you're mindful, then you can start doing something about it.
And then actually, as you rightly say, you can look at those thoughts and you can say, well, okay, is that actually a genuine worry? Is there something I can do, or is that just a thought expanding? And that's quite a nice exercise on its own. Okay, is there something I can do about this, or do I now need to accept that? Which of course is a very powerful strategy, which starts to take us into, you know, do I use an active coping strategy to resolve something, or is there really not an action attached to that worry, and therefore I need to accept that? You know, so it can be a very powerful approach to moving through one's life in a very positive way. You know, it's mindfulness isn't about just accepting and not doing things. It's absolutely about, you know, allowing you to move through your life in a way that allows you to be effective.